Good evening, everyone. There's something that I would really urgently like to share with the world, which part of it is, theoretical. Part of it's my hypothesis, but part of it is also conventional economic wisdom too. So what I am greatly concerned about is a potential, what I believe to be a potential coming recession next year in 2020. It is just theoretical, should be taken with a grain of salt. But I am definitely concerned about an economic downturn coming soon. And regardless of when the next economic downturn comes, I think that it'll be really bad, and for a few reasons, based on conventional economic wisdom. When it comes to monetary policy, which essentially has to do with like money supply and interest rates and stuff like that, you usually want to lower interest rates after a recession, not before a recession. And effectively, what the Federal Reserve has been doing is lowering their federal funds rate lower and lower, and has been having really low interest rates for a sustained period of time, which essentially is like easy money access for corporations, so they can effectively accumulate a lot of debt, stuff like that. And there won't be much leeway once a recession hits to lower interest rates to, help, jumpstart the economy again. Also, with the recent corporate tax cuts that happened about a year or so ago, that's again something that falls more under fiscal policy, which is something that usually you give tax cuts after a recession occurs, not beforehand. So it's going to be really, not only is this again allowing more national debt, it's going to cause corporations to use all that extra money to maybe borrow more debt, stuff like that, I think. But essentially, it's also going to make it hard for when the next recession occurs for there to be much, ways to, jumpstart the economy again, have businesses hire more workers, bring unemployment back to a lower level once the next recession hits. It's going to be harder to do that based on those big corporate tax cuts that have already been done, which again you want to do after a recession, not before a recession. Now comes to theoretical stuff. So I've written a paper and gathered a lot of empirical evidence on what I humbly hypothesize to believe potentially the underlying cause of the business cycle. Again, should be taken with a grain of salt. Essentially, what I did is wrote a paper titled the underlying my hypothesis for the underlying cause of the business cycle. And so essentially, what I found, what was really interesting, what I researched, is that there's a really high connection and correlation between the delinquency of loans rate and the unemployment rate. So in general, in economics, people often think, the unemployment rate, goes up and down as a result of the business cycle, right? But what's interesting, what I found is essentially what I've taken from the data and everything, my own personal hypothesis, is that the unemployment rate is essentially causing the delinquency of loans rate, causing businesses to have higher rates of like not being able to pay off their loans in time and stuff. And so, as crazy as that sounds, let me explain. So essentially, imagine that a business takes out a loan, right? Or maybe issues, bonds and, essentially gets like financial capital that way, or so to hire more employees and stuff. Well, imagine that the unemployment rate is at a really, really low point, to the point where it's harder to find workers, right? Either they might start demanding higher wages, or you just can't find any of them. Everyone's already pretty much has a job. And so essentially, if business takes a lot of money, still expecting to hopefully hire more workers and stuff, but they can't effectively find more workers and can't find an effective way to invest the money that they borrowed or so, then it's going to be hard for them to pay back on their interest payments. And so that's what I tried to show in my paper. I showed a mathematical equation, showed empirical evidence and stuff. And to even further prove my point, which is really interesting, is that there's something called a Greger causality test, which basically helps show a case for causation between two variables, an oversimplified explanation. And so essentially what it showed us that there's something called a p-value. So essentially there's a much lower p-value with the unemployment rate causing the delinquency of loans rate, rather than the delinquency of loans rate causing the unemployment rate. So essentially, it's really interesting that there's more potentially causation between unemployment rate causing delinquency of loans rate, not the other way around. So essentially, sort of how this relates to currently or so to our society and our economy is that essentially businesses will have empirically, which I found in people, are still accumulating lots and lots of debt, almost at a rate, almost at an accelerating rate. And essentially, what I think is going to happen is, since we've reached such a low unemployment rate, again, what's going to happen once businesses borrow all this debt, continue to borrow more money, issue more bonds, stuff like that, but then can't continuously find more workers. And so it's really interesting when you look at the unemployment rate over the many decades, is that before a recession hits, usually the unemployment rate tends to kind of flatten out, as if it's the timing when businesses, try to find workers, borrow more money, but then they can't effectively pay it off because they can't find a, marginal increase in labor or so to effectively pay off the interest payments. So anyway, so it's really interesting. And so again, I try to empirically show in my paper. It can be found on my academia.edu page or by going on my blog, Econ blog, so ECONTEEN blog. And so, and again, it's called it's called a hypothesis for the underlying cause of the business cycle. I think that's what it's called. But anyway, I'll provide it as a link below the video. Anyway, so I think in terms of solutions, what can we do? Well, an oversimplified explanation, I think lenders, like these institutions that lend out money and stuff, shouldn't lend out money nearly as much, should definitely tighten how much they lend out once the unemployment rate reaches a really low point, once it's really kind of flattened out in terms of how much it's increasing or decreasing. So then businesses can't, borrow this debt that they might have a hard time paying off or so because of having a hard time finding a marginal increase in workers. So anyway, that's my spiel, and so I'm trying to get the word out. Hopefully we can, prevent, the next recession from being too bad or so. Anyway, it's all just my hypothesis, so my paper and my prediction should all be taken with a grain of salt. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and Happy New Year, everyone.